What if I told you the most powerful mobster in American history was a man the FBI didn't even photograph until he was 64 years old? Picture this. November 14th, 1957. A quiet estate in the rolling hills of Appalachian, New York. Inside, 60 of the most dangerous men in America sit around tables discussing territories, resolving disputes, planning the future of organized crime. Then suddenly sirens, chaos, men in expensive suits scrambling through windows, running through the woods, abandoning their Cadillacs and Lincolns in desperate flight. State troopers arresting mob bosses left and right, exposing the existence of a national crime syndicate the government had denied existed. But one man slipped away that day. One man vanished into the shadows as effortlessly as smoke dissipating in the wind. His name was Russell Bufalino, and for the next 4 decades, he would remain the ghost that haunted American law enforcement. A phantom pulling strings that stretched from Pennsylvania coal mines to Las Vegas casinos, from Cuban hotels to union halls, from the highest offices of the Teamsters to the lowest graves where bodies were buried and never found. This is the story of Russell Bufalino, the silent puppet master who controlled organized crime for over 50 years. The man who quite possibly knew exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, and the monster whose name you probably don't know, which is exactly how he wanted it. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. If you're a fan of real gangster history and untold crime stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Give this video a like if you want more deep dive mobster documentaries. Now, let's travel back to 1903 to a small village in Sicily, where our story begins in the most humble of circumstances. On October 29, 1903, in the dusty, sun-baked village of Monte d'Oro, Sicily, a boy was born who would one day command an empire built on whispers and fear. Monte d'Oro. The name means Golden Mountain. Set in the heart of Sicily's sulfur mining region, a place where poverty wasn't just common. It was the air people breathed, the ground they walked on, the future they expected for their children. Russell Alfredo Bufalino entered a world that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Sicily in 1903 was a land of extremes. Breathtaking Mediterranean beauty concealing crushing poverty. Ancient honor codes coexisting with brutal violence. Devout Catholicism intertwined with criminal societies that operated as shadow governments. The Bufalino family, like most in Monte d'Oro, knew hardship intimately. Sicily had been a conquered land for millennia. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, all had ruled the island. And each occupation had taught the Sicilian people the same lesson. Trust no government. Trust no outsider. Trust only family and those bound by sacred oaths. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival wisdom earned through centuries of occupation and exploitation. In villages like Monte d'Oro, the official government in Palermo or Rome meant little. Real power resided in the hands of local bosses. Men of respect called womany daughter, men of honor. These were the figures who settled disputes, enforced contracts, protected the vulnerable for a price, and administered a rough justice that the distant corrupt official government could never provide. Young Russell grew up watching this parallel system of power. He saw how a word from the right man could resolve conflicts that might otherwise end in blood feuds lasting generations. He observed how true power operated quietly, how the loudest man in the room was rarely the most dangerous. He learned that respect commanded through fear was more lasting than affection earned through generosity. But more than anything, Russell learned to watch, to listen, to observe before speaking, to understand that information was more valuable than gold, and that a secret kept was a weapon stored for future use. These early lessons in Monte d'Oro would shape everything that came after. Like millions of other Italians in the early 20th century, the Bufalino family made the wrenching decision to leave Sicily for America. The exact year of their immigration varies in different accounts. Some sources suggest 1903, making Russell an infant, while others indicate the family arrived when Russell was a young child around 1906 or 1907. What we know for certain is that, like so many Italian immigrant families, they were fleeing poverty and seeking opportunity in the promised land across the Atlantic. The journey itself was an ordeal. Families like the Bufalinos traveled in steerage, the cheapest accommodation in the bowels of the ship, where hundreds of immigrants were packed into dark, airless compartments. The crossing took weeks. Seasickness was universal. Privacy was non-existent. Many immigrants, particularly children and the elderly, didn't survive the journey. Those who did arrive at Ellis Island traumatized, exhausted, but filled with desperate hope. Imagine young Russell, whether an infant or a small child, experiencing this transition. The only world he had known was the sun-drenched hills of Sicily, where everyone spoke Sicilian dialect, where the rhythms of life had remained unchanged for centuries, where family and tradition defined existence. Now he found himself in the chaos of Ellis Island, surrounded by a babel of dozens of languages, facing immigration officials who processed thousands of people daily with bureaucratic indifference. Branded with tags, examined by doctors, questioned, approved, or rejected, the Bufalino family was approved. They joined the flood of Italian immigrants heading for new lives in American cities. The family settled initially in Buffalo, New York, a city whose name, ironically, would echo Russell's surname throughout his life. Buffalo in the early 1900s was a booming industrial city, one of the largest in America, a major hub of steel production, grain processing, and manufacturing. The opening of the Erie Canal had made Buffalo wealthy, but that wealth was distributed inequitably for Italian immigrants. Buffalo meant grueling manual labor, cramped tenement housing, and pervasive discrimination. Russell's childhood in Buffalo unfolded in Italian ethnic enclaves, where Sicilian dialect was spoken more commonly than English, where old world traditions persisted alongside new world aspirations, where the Catholic Church provided spiritual comfort and social structure, and where organized crime offered what mainstream American society denied: opportunity, protection, and respect. Italian immigrants in early 20th century America faced vicious prejudice. They were considered racially inferior by the dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, stereotyped as violent, dirty, and criminal. Discrimination was open and legal. Italians were excluded from many jobs, neighborhoods, and social institutions. The largest mass lynching in American history occurred in New Orleans in 1891, when 11 Italian immigrants were murdered by a mob after being acquitted of charges in a police chief's killing. In this hostile environment, Italian communities turned inward, creating parallel societies where they controlled their own economic networks, social institutions, and systems of justice. This wasn't criminal behavior born of inherent violence. It was adaptive behavior born of exclusion and discrimination. Young Russell came of age in this world. He attended school sporadically, like most immigrant children. He was expected to work to help support the family. His formal education was limited, but his real education was profound. He learned English, but never lost his Sicilian dialect. He learned American ways, but never abandoned old world values. He developed a bicultural fluency that would prove invaluable in his future role as a bridge between Sicilian and American organized crime. In Buffalo's Italian neighborhoods, Russell would have encountered the Black Hand, la mano nera, the term used for Italian extortion rackets that terrorized immigrant communities. Black Hand operators sent threatening letters demanding payment, often decorated with drawings of black hands, daggers, or skulls. Those who refused to pay faced violence, bombings, arson, kidnappings, murder. The Black Hand wasn't a unified organization. It was more a method than a group, but it introduced young Russell to the mechanics of organized crime, how fear could be monetized, how protection rackets operated, how violence or the threat of violence could generate steady income with minimal investment. But Russell also witnessed the Black Hand's limitations. These were crude operations, short-term thinking, high-profile violence that attracted law enforcement attention. Russell, even as a boy, would have understood that there were smarter ways to operate. The Bufalino family eventually moved to northeastern Pennsylvania, settling in the coal mining region, where thousands of Italian immigrants found brutal work in the mines. This move, probably occurring when Russell was a teenager, would prove pivotal. Northeastern Pennsylvania would become Russell's base of operations for his entire criminal career. The Pennsylvania coal regions in the 1910s and 1920s were hardscrabble places, company towns where mining corporations wielded near feudal power over workers' lives. Miners lived in company housing, shopped at company stores, were paid in company scrip, often only redeemable at inflated prices at those same stores. They worked in conditions of unimaginable danger. Cave-ins, explosions, gas leaks, and simple crushing physical labor that destroyed men's bodies by their 40s. Italian immigrants occupied the lowest rungs of this harsh hierarchy. They received the most dangerous jobs, the worst housing, the least pay. Labor organizing was met with violence from company-hired thugs and corrupt local police. The companies owned the law, owned the politicians, owned the towns. In this environment, Russell Bufalino went to work in the mines. He descended into the earth each day, breathing coal dust, risking death in darkness, earning poverty wages. But unlike many miners, Russell didn't accept this as his fate. He watched, he learned, he worked. The coal mines were education for Russell in several crucial ways. First, he saw up close how power really operated in America, not through democracy or fairness, but through the ruthless exercise of economic control backed by violence. The coal companies were legal enterprises, but their methods differed little from criminal organizations. This taught Russell that the line between legitimate business and organized crime was thinner than society pretended. Second, the mines brought together men from all over Italy, Sicilians like Russell, but also Neapolitans, Calabrians, and others. Russell learned to navigate these different regional loyalties and rivalries, developing diplomatic skills that would serve him well in the fractious world of organized crime. Third, the mines exposed Russell to labor organizing and union politics. He saw firsthand how unions, despite their noble stated goals, could be corrupted, controlled, and used as vehicles for organized crime. This understanding would later make Russell a master of labor racketeering. But most importantly, the coal regions of Pennsylvania brought Russell into contact with established organized crime figures, particularly members of the Buffalo crime family, headed by Stefano Magaddino. Stefano Magaddino was born in Sicily in 1891 and immigrated to the United States as a young man. By the 1920s, he had established himself as a powerful figure in Buffalo's Italian underworld. Magaddino would eventually become one of the longest-serving and most successful mafia bosses in American history, running the Buffalo crime family for over 50 years until his death in 1974. Exactly how Russell Bufalino came to Magaddino's attention remains somewhat murky, as so much of Russell's early life does, but several factors likely played a role. The Bufalinos and Magaddinos both came from Sicily, which created a foundational bond. Both families had settled in the Buffalo, Pennsylvania corridor, and Russell, even as a young man, apparently displayed qualities that marked him as special: intelligence, discretion, reliability, ambition tempered by patience. By the early 1920s, Russell was no longer just a coal miner. He had begun involving himself in various enterprises that operated in the gray zone between legal and illegal bootlegging, gambling, labor issues. He was building a reputation as someone who could be trusted, who kept his mouth shut, who understood that loyalty was the supreme virtue in the world he was entering. The 1920s were transformative years for organized crime in America, and Russell Bufalino's timing was impeccable. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol throughout the country. Prohibition, intended to improve public morality and reduce crime, instead created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Overnight, a legal industry serving a massive public demand became an illegal industry with even greater demand. Americans didn't stop drinking when Prohibition began. They just started buying alcohol from criminals. The market was enormous, the profits staggering. And organized crime rushed to supply this suddenly illegal product. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other ethnic criminal organizations expanded rapidly during Prohibition, transforming from small-time street gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises with national reach. The money flowing from bootlegging allowed these organizations to corrupt law enforcement, politicians, and judges on an unprecedented scale. Prohibition didn't create organized crime in America, but it made organized crime rich, powerful, and deeply embedded in American political and economic systems. Russell Bufalino was in his late teens and early 20s during Prohibition, the perfect age to rise in this rapidly expanding criminal universe. The Magadino organization in Buffalo was deeply involved in bootlegging, smuggling Canadian whiskey across Lake Erie and Niagara Falls into the United States. Northeastern Pennsylvania, with its proximity to Buffalo and New York City, was ideal territory for distribution operations. Russell's role in Prohibition-era bootlegging isn't well documented, which itself tells us something about how he operated. While flashier gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago were making headlines with spectacular violence, Russell worked quietly building connections, proving reliable, demonstrating the qualities that would define his entire career. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, Russell Bufalino had accomplished several crucial things. He had established himself within the Magadino family organization. He had developed networks that extended from Buffalo through Pennsylvania to New York City. He had accumulated capital that would allow him to invest in various legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. He had married and started a family, creating the appearance of respectability that would serve as his cover for decades. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned the fundamental lesson that would guide his entire criminal career. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and let others take the spotlight while you accumulate real power behind the scenes. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, organized crime faced a crisis. The golden goose was dead. The massive revenue stream from bootlegging dried up overnight. Criminal organizations that had grown fat on bootlegging profits needed to find new revenue sources or face collapse. Many gangsters struggled with this transition. Some tried to continue in the alcohol business legally, but couldn't compete with legitimate distillers and distributors. Others doubled down on traditional rackets, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, but found these couldn't match bootlegging's profitability. The most violent operators, like some of Capone's Chicago crew, simply escalated their criminal activities and attracted increased law enforcement attention. Russell Bufalino characteristically was smarter. He understood that Prohibition's end didn't mean the end of opportunity. It meant adaptation was necessary, and he had been preparing for this transition. By the mid-1930s, Russell had relocated permanently to Kingston, Pennsylvania, a small city in Luzerne County, about 120 miles northwest of Philadelphia and 150 miles west of New York City. Kingston and the surrounding Wyoming Valley would remain Russell's base of operations for the rest of his life. This choice of location was brilliant for several reasons. Kingston was small enough that Russell could become a significant local figure, building relationships with politicians, police, and business people. But it was also strategically located close enough to major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Buffalo for criminal activities, but far enough away to avoid the intense law enforcement scrutiny those cities attracted. Northeastern Pennsylvania was in essence perfect territory for a criminal boss who valued invisibility. Russell established several legitimate businesses in Kingston that served multiple purposes. He opened a jewelry store on Wyoming Avenue in Kingston. He invested in a car dealership. He bought interests in various local businesses, a dress factory, vending machine companies, real estate. These businesses provided legitimate income to explain Russell's lifestyle, gave him a respectable cover in the community, offered opportunities for money laundering, and created employment for associates and family members. The jewelry store deserves particular attention. Located in downtown Kingston, it operated as a real business serving real customers. But it also functioned as Russell's headquarters, a place where associates could meet with him under the guise of shopping, where money could be moved through jewelry transactions, where stolen goods could be fenced. The store allowed Russell to present himself as a successful local businessman, which he was in a sense, even if his business empire extended far beyond retail jewelry. Russell married Carrie Chandra, whose family had its own connections to organized crime. Carrie came from Monte Doro, the same Sicilian village as Russell. These old-world connections mattered deeply in mafia culture. The couple eventually adopted a daughter, and Russell maintained the appearance of a devoted family man throughout his life. This domestic stability was part of his camouflage, allowing him to blend into respectable middle-class society while running criminal operations. By all accounts, Russell was a good husband and father within the limited scope his double life allowed. He attended church, participated in community events, supported local charities, neighbors, and acquaintances who knew him or thought they knew him, described him as quiet, polite, generous. He was the kind of man who could walk down Kingston streets and exchange pleasant greetings with shopkeepers, police officers, and politicians, all of whom had no idea of his real activities. This ability to maintain separate identities, respectable businessman and criminal boss, was central to Russell's success. Unlike mobsters who flaunted their wealth and power, Russell cultivated ordinariness. He dressed conservatively, lived in a nice but not ostentatious house, drove good but not flashy cars. He never drew attention to himself. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Russell maintained his relationship with Stefano Magaddino's Buffalo crime family. The exact nature of this relationship evolved over time and has been debated by organized crime historians. Some sources describe Russell as a captain or capo regime in the Buffalo family. Others suggest he operated semi-independently while maintaining a tributary relationship with Buffalo. What's clear is that Russell had Magaddino's blessing to operate in northeastern Pennsylvania, and that the two men remained closely allied throughout their careers. Magaddino himself was a fascinating figure, one of the original members of the Mafia's Commission, the ruling body established in the 1930s to govern organized crime and prevent the kind of inter-family warfare that had marked the 1920s. Magaddino was old-school Sicilian, deeply traditional, cautious, and like Russell, relatively low profile compared to more flamboyant mobsters in New York and Chicago. The relationship between Magaddino and Bufalino seems to have been genuinely close. Based on mutual respect and complementary styles, Magaddino appreciated Russell's discretion and competence. Russell benefited from Magaddino's protection and the connection to the Commission. This relationship gave Russell legitimacy within the broader Mafia structure and access to national-level organized crime networks. Through Magadino, Russell developed relationships with other powerful crime families, particularly in New York. The 5 families that dominated New York City, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, were the epicenter of American organized crime. And Russell cultivated connections with all of them. Though he was particularly close to the Genovese family, Vito Genovese, one of the most powerful and feared mobsters of his era, became an important ally. Genovese had fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges, but returned to the United States after World War II and eventually assumed control of what became the Genovese crime family, one of New York's most powerful. Russell and Genovese shared Sicilian heritage, old world values, and a strategic approach to organized crime. Their alliance would prove crucial during the pivotal events of the 1950s. Russell also developed relationships with Carlo Gambino, who would become boss of the Gambino family in 1957, and is considered by many historians to be the most powerful American mobster of the 1960s and 1970s. Russell and Gambino operated similarly. Both avoided publicity. Both cultivated legitimate business covers. Both believed in consensus and diplomacy over violence when possible. These national connections transformed Russell from a regional operator into a figure of national significance within organized crime. By the late 1940s, Russell Bufalino was not just running rackets in Pennsylvania. He was a recognized member of the National Mafia network, someone who attended high-level meetings, mediated disputes, and influenced decisions affecting organized crime throughout the country. One of Russell's most successful and least understood operations involved the garment industry. The clothing manufacturing business centered in New York City, but with operations throughout the Northeast, was heavily unionized and deeply infiltrated by organized crime. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, and related unions represented hundreds of thousands of workers in clothing factories. These unions negotiated wages, working conditions, and contracts between workers and manufacturers. Control over these unions meant control over the entire industry, the ability to call strikes or prevent them, to drive competitors out of business, to extract payments from manufacturers, to embezzle union funds, to manipulate union pension and welfare funds. Russell, working with associates in New York, developed significant influence within garment industry unions. He didn't control these unions completely. They were too large and complex for any single figure to dominate. But he had enough influence to profit substantially. Manufacturers would pay Russell's organization to ensure labor peace. Union officials on Russell's payroll would steer contracts to favored companies. Pension fund investments would be directed to projects that benefited organized crime. The genius of this operation was its complexity and legitimacy. Russell wasn't running obvious rackets like gambling or loan sharking. He was operating within legal economic structures, exploiting their complexity, using legitimate positions, union officials, business consultants, labor negotiators to extract illegal profits. This kind of sophisticated racketeering was much harder for law enforcement to detect and prosecute than traditional street crime. The garment industry operations also connected Russell to the Teamsters Union, which would become central to his story in later decades. Union racketeering became a specialty for Russell Bufalino and would remain a major source of his power and wealth throughout his career. The fundamental dynamics were simple. Unions controlled billions of dollars in worker dues, pension funds, and welfare funds. Union leaders could shut down businesses with strikes, or conversely, guarantee labor peace. This power made unions irresistible targets for organized crime infiltration. The Mafia's approach to union racketeering was multifaceted. Organized crime installed its own members in union leadership positions, either through legitimate election backed by intimidation or simply by taking control. They corrupted legitimate union leaders through bribes or threats. They created sweetheart contracts where union leaders would accept below-market wages in exchange for payoffs, betraying the workers they supposedly represented. They embezzled from union treasuries and pension funds. They used union positions to extort employers. Russell Bufalino understood that union racketeering offered several advantages over traditional organized crime activities. It generated enormous steady revenue. It was difficult for law enforcement to prosecute because it involved complex financial transactions rather than obvious crimes like drug dealing or murder. It provided legitimate cover and legitimate income, and it gave organized crime influence over crucial sectors of the American economy. By the 1940s, Russell had established himself as a major player in labor racketeering across Pennsylvania and beyond. His operations touched various unions, garment workers, teamsters, miners, and others. He cultivated relationships with union leaders, offering them a simple proposition: cooperate and profit, or resist and suffer. This was Russell Bufalino at his most effective, operating in the shadows of legitimate institutions, extracting wealth through complexity and intimidation, building power that was real but largely invisible to the public and even to most law enforcement. World War II brought new opportunities for organized crime. A massive wartime economy, government contracts, rationing, black markets, and general social disruption created numerous avenues for illegal profit. Russell, like many mobsters, apparently profited from wartime conditions. Though the specific details remain murky, one area where organized crime thrived during the war involved rationing. The government imposed rationing on various goods: gasoline, rubber, sugar, meat, and others. To support the war effort, rationing created black markets. And black markets meant opportunity for organized criminals who could supply rationed goods illegally. Russell's legitimate businesses, his car dealership for instance, could serve as fronts for black market activities. Stolen ration coupons could be sold. Scarce goods could be diverted from legal channels and sold at inflated prices. Government contracts could be manipulated through bribery and fraud. Additionally, the war years saw massive internal migration as Americans moved to industrial centers for defense work. This social disruption, combined with the absence of millions of men in military service, created opportunities for gambling, prostitution, and other vice operations. Russell characteristically kept a low profile during the war years. While some mobsters became wealthy and notorious through wartime activities, Russell operated quietly, building wealth and connections without attracting attention. By 1945, when the war ended, Russell Bufalino was in his early 40s. He had survived and thrived through Depression, Prohibition's end, and World War. He had established himself as a successful businessman in Kingston. He had built a criminal empire that extended across multiple states and involved multiple rackets. He had developed relationships with the most powerful mob bosses in America. But Russell was still relatively unknown outside organized crime circles. The FBI had no significant file on him. His name rarely appeared in newspapers. To his Kingston neighbors, he was simply Russell Bufalino, the jeweler and businessman. This anonymity was about to change, or rather almost change in the most dramatic way possible. At some point in the early to mid-1950s, the exact date is unclear, Russell Bufalino effectively became the boss of what would be called the Northeastern Pennsylvania crime family, though he may never have used that title himself. This family was relatively small by Mafia standards, with perhaps a few dozen made members and a few hundred associates, but it controlled significant territory and operations. The structure of Russell's organization reflected the traditional mafia hierarchy. Russell as boss, though he always maintained he was just a businessman and boss, and consigliere counselor to advise him. Several capos captains who each supervised crews of soldiers and numerous associates who worked with the organization without being formally inducted as members. Russell's family controlled criminal operations throughout northeastern Pennsylvania, including gambling, loan sharking, extortion, labor racketeering, and various other enterprises. They had connections and operations extending into New York, Ohio, Michigan, and beyond. The family was relatively violence-averse compared to some organizations. Russell preferred negotiation and intimidation over killing, but they were certainly capable of violence when necessary. What made Russell unusual as a boss was his continued commitment to invisibility. Most men who reached that position enjoyed the respect, the deference, the power. Russell seemed to actively avoid recognition. He never held court in social clubs where associates would come to pay respect, as many bosses did. He didn't surround himself with bodyguards. He drove his own car, lived modestly, maintained his legitimate business cover. This wasn't humility or lack of ego. It was strategic brilliance. Russell understood that the more visible a mob boss became, the more law enforcement would target him. He had watched what happened to flashy gangsters like Al Capone and Frank Costello. He was determined not to make their mistakes. By the mid-1950s, the American Mafia faced several serious problems that required high-level discussion and coordination. The Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime, 1950 to 1951, had exposed the national reach of the Mafia and put pressure on law enforcement to act. Internal disputes between families threatened to break into open warfare. The question of drug trafficking divided the organization. Some bosses wanted to exploit this enormously profitable trade, while others feared it would attract too much law enforcement heat. Vito Genovese recently returned from Italy and consolidating power within his family was particularly concerned about these issues. Genovese had ambitions to become boss of bosses, the supreme leader of the American Mafia, a position that had been vacant since the murder of Salvatore Maranzano in 1931. To achieve this, Genovese needed to demonstrate leadership and build consensus among the various families. A meeting of top mafia leaders was proposed for November 1957. These gatherings had occurred before. The commission met periodically, and various regional meetings happened regularly. But this meeting would be particularly significant in terms of attendance and agenda. The question was where to hold it. The meeting needed to be somewhere private, secure, away from the prying eyes of law enforcement. And someone suggested the perfect location: the estate of Joseph Joe the Barber Barbara in Appalachian, New York, a small rural town about 200 miles northwest of New York City and close to the Pennsylvania border. Joseph Barbara was a successful, legitimate businessman who owned a soda bottling company and a large estate in Appalachian. He was also a made member of the Mafia, with connections to several families. Barbara's estate seemed ideal, remote, spacious, owned by someone above suspicion. And critically, the Barbara estate was in Russell Bufalino's territory. Russell knew the area intimately, had relationships with local law enforcement, and could provide security and logistics for the meeting. Russell's role in organizing the Appalachian meeting has been debated, but most sources agree he was heavily involved working with Genovese and others to coordinate this gathering. Russell knew the territory, had the local connections, and had the organizational skills to manage such a complex event. Invitations went out through the Mafia's informal communication network. Bosses and underbosses from crime families across the country made plans to attend. The meeting was scheduled for November 14th, 1957. No one imagined it would become the most famous disaster in Mafia history. On the morning of November 14th, expensive cars began arriving at the Barbara estate. Cadillacs, Lincolns, Imperials, the finest automobiles of the era, driven by or carrying men in expensive suits with even more expensive jewelry. They came from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, California, Florida, and elsewhere. The attendee list would later read like a who's who of organized crime. Vito Genovese was there, of course, along with other New York bosses. Carlo Gambino attended. Joseph Profaci, of what would become the Colombo family, was present. Sam Giancana from Chicago sent representatives. Joseph Bonanno was invited but didn't attend, which would later prove fortunate for him. Stefano Magaddino sent representatives. In total, approximately 60 to 100 mafia figures, accounts vary, gathered at the Barbara estate that day. The meeting's agenda apparently included several items. Confirming Genovese's assumption of leadership within his family following the recent murder of Albert Anastasia. Discussing narcotics policy, Genovese wanted to loosen restrictions on drug trafficking, resolving territorial disputes, and addressing the growing problem of law enforcement attention following the Kefauver hearings. But the meeting would never complete its agenda. Joseph Barbara was known to New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Crosswell, a tenacious investigator who had been monitoring Barbara's activities. Crosswell suspected Barbara's legitimate businesses were covers for criminal activities, but he had never been able to prove it. When Crosswell noticed an unusual number of expensive cars at Barbara's estate and decided to investigate, he made a routine stop to check on a reservation at a nearby hotel. The hotel receptionist mentioned that several guests had recently checked in, all from out of state, all requesting rooms for just one night. Crosswell's instincts told him something significant was happening. He called for backup and set up a roadblock on the road leading away from the Barbara estate. Inside the estate, the meeting was underway. The attendees were relaxed, confident. They had no reason to expect trouble. Then someone spotted police cars approaching the property. Panic erupted. 60 of the most powerful mobsters in America suddenly became terrified men fleeing through the woods. Some ran in their expensive suits and dress shoes across muddy fields. Others abandoned their cars and tried to hide. A few attempted to bluff their way past police, claiming they were just visiting their friend Joe Barbara, who is feeling ill. It was chaos, humiliating, and absolutely devastating for the Mafia. Police detained 58 men that day. They documented names, addresses, and other identifying information. They noted the expensive cars with out-of-state license plates. They photographed faces, and crucially, they proved beyond any doubt that a national organized crime syndicate existed, something J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had long denied. Here's where Russell Bufalino's story becomes particularly interesting. Despite being deeply involved in organizing the meeting, despite being on his home territory, despite dozens of mobsters being caught that day, Russell Bufalino escaped. The exact details of his escape remain murky, which is entirely characteristic of Russell. Some accounts suggest he slipped away before the police arrived, warned by lookouts, or simply leaving early. Other sources claim he was among those who fled through the woods, but managed to evade capture where others were caught. A few theories suggest Russell had cultivated relationships with local law enforcement that allowed him to be conveniently overlooked. What we know for certain is this: Russell Bufalino's name did not appear on the list of attendees detained at Appalachian, even though he was almost certainly present and heavily involved in organizing the meeting. This escape was quintessentially Russell, while more prominent. Bosses like Vito Genovese were caught and humiliated, while men who considered themselves smarter and more powerful than Russell were photographed being led away by police. Russell vanished like smoke. It was the most important meeting in modern Mafia history, and Russell Bufalino managed to be there and not be there simultaneously. The irony is rich. The meeting was supposed to be secret, and its exposure destroyed that secrecy. But Russell maintained his personal secrecy, even in the midst of that exposure. The Appalachian meeting was a catastrophe for the American Mafia. The raid provided undeniable proof that organized crime operated nationally, was highly structured, and included many men who claimed to be legitimate businessmen. The public was outraged. Politicians demanded action. J. Edgar Hoover, who had long denied the Mafia's existence. Possibly because he feared the FBI couldn't successfully fight it. Or possibly because the Mafia had compromising information on him, was forced to acknowledge reality and dedicate significant FBI resources to fighting organized crime. Many of the men caught at Appalachian faced legal consequences. Some were convicted of conspiracy to obstruct justice for refusing to explain why they were at the meeting. Others faced increased scrutiny from law enforcement in their home territories. Several had their reputations damaged within the Mafia for being caught in such an embarrassing raid. Vito Genovese, despite his ambitions to become boss of bosses, found his power diminished rather than enhanced by Appalachian. The meeting he had orchestrated to solidify his leadership instead became a symbol of his poor judgment. Within 2 years, Genovese would be convicted on narcotics charges in what many believe was a frame-up orchestrated by rivals, including Meyer Lansky and Carlo Gambino. He would die in prison in 1969. The Appalachian raid also marked a turning point for law enforcement. The FBI created what would become its organized crime program, dedicating agents to building intelligence on Mafia families, developing informants, and using new investigative techniques. State and local police departments also ramped up their anti-Mafia efforts. The days of organized crime operating with relative impunity were ending. Though it would take decades for law enforcement to truly dismantle the Mafia's power for Russell Bufalino. However, Appalachian had a paradoxical effect. On one hand, his involvement in organizing the meeting became known within law enforcement circles, and the FBI began building a file on him. He was no longer completely unknown to federal authorities. On the other hand, his escape from the raid enhanced his reputation within the Mafia. While other bosses were caught and humiliated, Russell had ghosted away. This reinforced everything his colleagues already knew about him. Russell was smart, careful, and lucky, all crucial qualities in organized crime. More importantly, the exposure of other bosses at Appalachian created a power vacuum that Russell was perfectly positioned to fill. As more visible mob leaders faced increased law enforcement pressure, Russell's low profile became even more valuable. Associates and other families increasingly turned to Russell as a mediator, an advisor, someone who could facilitate operations without attracting attention. Before we move forward to the 1960s, we need to discuss Russell's involvement in Cuba, which represents one of the most fascinating and historically significant aspects of his criminal career. In the 1950s, Cuba was a paradise for American organized crime. President Fulgencio Batista, who ruled Cuba as a dictator, was thoroughly corrupt and willing to partner with American mobsters to turn Havana into a Caribbean Las Vegas. Meyer Lansky, the brilliant Jewish gangster who partnered closely with Italian Mafia families, orchestrated much of the Cuba operation. The arrangement was elegant. American mobsters would build and operate luxury hotels and casinos in Havana. These establishments would attract wealthy American tourists seeking tropical glamour, gambling and entertainment unavailable in most of the United States. The casinos would generate enormous profits, which would be split between the mob and Batista's government. Additionally, Cuba served as a crucial transshipment point for narcotics coming from South America and heading to the United States. Russell Bufalino had interests in Cuban operations, working primarily through his connections with the Genovese and Lucchese families, who were heavily invested in Havana casinos. The exact nature and extent of Russell's Cuban involvement remains somewhat unclear. He was too smart to leave detailed records, but FBI documents and testimony from various informants over the years confirm he profited from the Cuban operations. Cuba in the 1950s represented organized crime at its most successful. Massive legal profits from casinos, illegal profits from drugs and prostitution, all protected by a corrupt government that was an active partner in the enterprise. Havana was stunning. Art Deco hotels, spectacular nightclubs featuring world-famous entertainers, beaches, beautiful women, and endless opportunities for vice for American gangsters. It must have seemed like the perfect score, an arrangement that could last forever. Then came January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces overthrew Batista on New Year's Day, 1959, and one of their first actions was shutting down the mob-controlled casinos. Castro's government seized mob-owned properties without compensation. Overnight, organized crime lost hundreds of millions of dollars in investments and future earnings from Cuba. The mob naturally was furious. There were discussions about assassinating Castro, about supporting counter-revolutionary forces to overthrow his government, about anything that might restore their Cuban paradise. The CIA, itself interested in removing Castro for political reasons, would eventually partner with organized crime figures in various unsuccessful plots to kill the Cuban leader. For Russell Bufalino, the loss of Cuba meant the loss of significant income, but it also meant something else: the need to find replacement revenue. This would drive organized crime's increased focus on other areas, expanding Las Vegas operations, ramping up narcotics trafficking, and intensifying control over labor unions. The last point would prove crucial for Russell's next chapter. With Cuba closed, Las Vegas became even more important to organized crime. The Nevada desert city had been developing as a gambling mecca since the 1940s, with mob money building increasingly spectacular casinos. Unlike Cuba, Las Vegas operations were legal. Nevada had legalized gambling, but organized crime controlled many casinos through hidden ownership, skimming profits before they were officially counted and using the casinos for money laundering. Russell Bufalino, through various fronts and associates, had interests in several Las Vegas casinos during the 1960s and 1970s. He didn't own casinos outright. That would have been too visible, but he held hidden interests and benefited from skimming operations. The beauty of casino skimming was its simplicity. Before casino revenue was officially counted and taxed, a portion would be removed and distributed to hidden mob investors. This provided enormous untaxed income. Las Vegas also served another crucial function. It was a meeting place. Mobsters from different cities could visit Las Vegas for seemingly legitimate reasons: entertainment, gambling, business deals, and conduct mafia business without attracting the attention they would draw meeting in places like New York or Chicago. Russell made numerous trips to Las Vegas over the years, always staying in the background, always presenting himself as just another businessman enjoying the city's attractions. One of the most consequential issues facing the mafia in the 1950s and 1960s was narcotics trafficking. The drug trade was enormously profitable, but also enormously dangerous. Drug dealing attracted harsh criminal penalties and intense law enforcement attention. Additionally, many old-school mafiosi raised with traditional Sicilian values considered drug dealing dishonorable, something that preyed on human weakness in a way that gambling or bootlegging didn't. The mafia's official position, particularly after the 1957 Appalachian meeting, was supposed to be against narcotics trafficking. Made members were theoretically prohibited from dealing drugs, but this prohibition was frequently ignored because the profits were simply too large to resist. Russell Bufalino's position on drugs was pragmatic. He apparently believed the official prohibition was wise. Drug dealing did attract law enforcement heat that could threaten the entire organization. But he also recognized that some members would deal drugs regardless of any official ban, and trying to enforce an absolute prohibition would create internal conflicts. Russell's solution seems to have been a don't ask, don't tell approach. Don't get involved directly. Don't sanction drug operations openly, but don't crack down too harshly on those who do participate, as long as they're discreet, and don't bring heat on the family. This pragmatic flexibility was characteristic of Russell's leadership style. He was neither a rigid traditionalist nor a reckless innovator. He adapted to circumstances, balanced competing interests, and prioritized the organization's stability over ideological purity. If there was one relationship that defined Russell Bufalino's power in the 1960s and 1970s, it was his connection to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the powerful labor union that represented truck drivers, warehouse workers, and others involved in transportation and logistics. The Teamsters by the 1960s were the largest and one of the most powerful unions in America. With over 1 million members, the union controlled transportation throughout the country. And in an economy dependent on shipping goods by truck, the ability to call or prevent strikes gave the Teamsters enormous leverage over American business. The Teamsters were also thoroughly corrupted by organized crime. The Union Central States Pension Fund, which managed billions of dollars in worker pensions, had become essentially a bank for the Mafia, providing loans to mob-connected businesses, including many Las Vegas casinos. Union positions provided excellent salaries and benefits for mobsters and their associates. The union's political influence could be used to protect mob interests, and the union itself could be used for traditional labor racketeering, extorting employers, embezzling funds, creating no-show jobs. Russell Bufalino had significant influence within the Teamsters, particularly in Pennsylvania, in the eastern United States. He cultivated relationships with union officials, placed associates in union positions, and benefited enormously from access to pension fund money and union power. But Russell's most significant Teamsters connection wasn't a union official. It was a truck driver and union organizer named Frank Sheeran. Frank the Irishman Sheeran was born in 1920 in Camden, New Jersey, to Irish-American parents. He served in World War II, participating in some of the war's bloodiest combat in Italy and Germany. He returned from the war like many veterans. Traumatized by what he had seen and done, he took a job as a truck driver and joined the Teamsters. Sheeran was a large, physically intimidating man. Over 6 feet tall, solidly built with a presence that suggested violence, even when he was being friendly. He also had a talent for organized crime's grimmer work. The question, "I heard you paint houses," mob code for "I heard you kill people," with paint referring to blood splatter, would allegedly become associated with Sheeran, though the phrase's actual use is debated. Russell Bufalino and Frank Sheeran met in the 1950s, though the exact circumstances vary in different accounts. What's clear is that Russell recognized Sheeran's usefulness and began cultivating their relationship. Russell sponsored Sheeran's induction into the Mafia, unusual for an Irishman. As the Mafia traditionally restricted membership to men of Italian descent, but not unheard of when someone proved valuable, Sheeran became Russell's trusted associate enforcer, and eventually his connection to Jimmy Hoffa. Sheeran in his later years would claim to have been a prolific mob hitman, responsible for dozens of murders on Russell's orders. Some of these claims have been verified. Some remain unverifiable, and some have been disputed by law enforcement and other investigators. Sheeran's reliability as a source has been debated extensively. But whatever the truth of specific claims, it's clear that Sheeran performed services for Russell Bufalino over many years, and that their relationship was central to both men's lives. Through Sheeran, Russell developed a relationship with the most powerful labor leader in America, Jimmy Hoffa. James Riddle Hoffa was born in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, and grew up in Detroit. He began his union career as a teenager organizing grocery store workers. He joined the Teamsters in 1932 and rapidly rose through the ranks, demonstrating a genius for labor organizing, negotiation, and the ruthless application of power. Hoffa became president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957, the same year as the Appalachian Meeting. Under Hoffa's leadership, the Teamsters became even more powerful, expanding membership and negotiating national contracts that improved wages and benefits for truck drivers across America. Hoffa was legitimately popular with rank-and-file Teamsters who saw him as a fighter for workers' rights. But Hoffa was also deeply connected to organized crime. He used mob muscle to intimidate rivals within the union and to threaten employers during organizing campaigns. He gave the mob access to the Central States Pension Fund, which financed casino construction in Las Vegas and other mob enterprises. He accepted payoffs and kickbacks. He employed violence against those who opposed him. The relationship between Hoffa and the Mafia was symbiotic. Hoffa got muscle and financing from the mob. The mob got access to pension fund money, union positions for associates, and the ability to use Teamster power for their benefit. It was a partnership that made both sides enormously wealthy and powerful. Russell Bufalino through Frank. Sheeran developed a close relationship with Hoffa. Russell appreciated Hoffa's intelligence and effectiveness. Hoffa respected Russell's wisdom and connections. They were in many ways similar men. Both had risen from humble origins through intelligence and ruthlessness. Both understood power. Both operated in the gray zone between legitimate and criminal enterprises. Throughout the 1960s, this triangle, Russell, Sheeran, and Hoffa, would shape labor relations, organized crime, and eventually one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. The early 1960s brought a new threat to organized crime and to Jimmy Hoffa, specifically Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy became president in January 1961, he appointed his younger brother, Robert, as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy had served as chief counsel to the Senate's McClellan Committee, which had investigated labor racketeering and focused particularly on Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. Kennedy had developed an intense personal hatred for Hoffa, viewing him as a corrupt thug who had betrayed American workers. Hoffa returned the hatred, viewing Kennedy as a spoiled rich kid using government power to destroy working-class leaders. As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy made going after Hoffa and organized crime a top priority. He dramatically expanded the Justice Department's organized crime section, hired new prosecutors, and used aggressive investigative techniques. Kennedy was particularly focused on convicting Jimmy Hoffa, whom he saw as the personification of labor corruption. The mob was deeply concerned about the Kennedy administration. There were rumors, never proven, but persistent, that organized crime had helped Kennedy win the 1960 election through vote manipulation in crucial states like Illinois, and that Kennedy's subsequent attack on the mob represented a betrayal. Some mob bosses, particularly Carlos Marcello in New Orleans and Santo Trafficante in Florida, allegedly discussed killing Robert Kennedy, or even President Kennedy himself. Russell Bufalino characteristically kept his opinions about the Kennedys private. He undoubtedly opposed their anti-mob campaign and worried about the threat to his interests, but he didn't engage in reckless talk about killing federal officials. Russell understood that murdering a president or attorney general would bring down unimaginable law enforcement heat on organized crime. Whatever his private thoughts, he maintained public discretion. The Kennedy problem would resolve itself in the most tragic way possible. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder. but was himself killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with organized crime connections. The Kennedy assassination has spawned countless conspiracy theories, many involving organized crime. Some theories suggest the mob killed Kennedy in retaliation to Robert Kennedy's anti-mob campaign. Others claim Hoffa was involved. Still others weave complex narratives involving the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and various mob figures. The evidence for mob involvement in the Kennedy assassination is circumstantial and inconclusive. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which investigated the murder in the late 1970s, concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, but found no proof of mob involvement. Most serious historians and investigators believe Oswald acted alone, though debate continues. Russell Bufalino's name has appeared in some Kennedy assassination theories, usually as someone who would have been consulted if organized crime did plan the killing. There's no credible evidence linking Russell directly to the assassination, and his cautious nature suggests he would have strongly opposed such a high-profile, risky operation. What is clear is that Kennedy's death removed the mob's most aggressive enemy from power. Robert Kennedy remained Attorney General for several months, but was devastated by his brother's death and less focused on his anti-mob campaign. When he resigned in 1964 to run for Senate, the sustained pressure on organized crime eased considerably. Despite the Kennedy assassination, Jimmy Hoffa's legal problems continued to mount throughout the 1960s. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department had built multiple cases against him, and prosecutors continued pursuing these cases even after Kennedy left the Attorney General position. In 1964, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering, fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. Hoffa appealed the convictions and remained free on bail while the appeals process ground through the courts. But his situation was increasingly desperate. Russell Bufalino, as Hoffa's friend and ally, provided support during this difficult period. But Russell was also pragmatic. He began considering what a post-Hoffa Teamsters might look like and ensuring that Russell's interests would be protected regardless of who led the union. This pragmatism, loyalty balanced with self-preservation, was vintage Russell Bufalino in the early 1960s. The FBI finally managed to photograph Russell Bufalino. The exact circumstances vary in different accounts, but what's remarkable is that the FBI, which had been investigating organized crime for years and had massive photo files on mobsters, had no picture of Russell Bufalino until he was in his 60s. This reflects Russell's extraordinary success at avoiding publicity and surveillance. While other mob bosses had been photographed countless times, appearing in newspapers, captured in surveillance photos, documented at various events, Russell had remained essentially invisible. The FBI's first photo of Russell shows an ordinary-looking man in his 60s, balding with glasses, wearing a conservative suit. He looks like a retired accountant or a small-town businessman, which was exactly the image Russell cultivated. There was nothing in his appearance that suggested power or danger. He could walk into any restaurant, store, or office in America without anyone giving him a second glance. But by the mid-1960s, the FBI was watching Russell Bufalino carefully. They had identified him as boss of the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family. They knew about his national connections. They had linked him to various criminal activities. They were building a file on him slowly and patiently, hoping to find evidence that would allow them to prosecute him successfully. Russell knew he was being watched, but he also knew that watching wasn't the same as proving. As long as he remained careful, as long as he insulated himself from direct involvement in criminal acts, as long as he maintained his businessman cover, the FBI would struggle to build a prosecutable case. This cat and mouse game between Russell and law enforcement would continue for decades. By the mid-1960s, Russell Bufalino oversaw a diverse criminal empire that generated millions of dollars annually. His operations included gambling. Russell's organization ran bookmaking operations, numbers games, and illegal casinos throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Gambling was reliable, relatively low risk compared to other crimes, and generated steady income. Loan sharking, lending money at exorbitant interest rates to people who couldn't get legitimate loans, then collecting through intimidation and violence. Loan sharking was closely connected to gambling. Problem gamblers often needed loans to cover debts, creating a vicious cycle that profited Russell's organization. Labor racketeering, control over union positions, pension fund manipulation, extortion of employers, no-show jobs, and embezzlement. This was probably Russell's most lucrative area of operation and the hardest for law enforcement to prosecute. Illegal businesses, cigarette smuggling, buying cigarettes in low-tax states and selling them in high-tax states, stolen property fencing, various frauds and scams. Legitimate businesses. Russell owned or had interests in numerous legitimate businesses: real estate, a dress factory, vending machine companies, car dealerships, and others. These provided legal income, money laundering opportunities, and employment for associates, protection rackets. Businesses paying for protection from violence that Russell's organization would itself provide if payment stopped. The key to Russell's success was diversification. He didn't depend on any single revenue stream. He balanced high profit, high risk operations like drug trafficking, which he participated in peripherally through associates, with lower profit, lower risk operations like legitimate businesses. He constantly adapted to changing circumstances, seizing new opportunities while abandoning operations that became too risky. Russell's power extended into politics. He cultivated relationships with local politicians, police chiefs, judges, and prosecutors throughout Pennsylvania. These relationships were maintained through a combination of campaign contributions, bribes, and implied threats. Local political corruption was crucial for Russell's operations. Corrupt police would ignore gambling operations or provide warnings about raids. Corrupt prosecutors would decline to file charges or would file weak cases designed to fail. Corrupt judges would impose minimal sentences when convictions occurred. Corrupt politicians would provide zoning approvals, licenses, and other official actions that benefited Russell's businesses. Russell's approach to political corruption was subtle and long-term. He didn't crudely bribe officials with suitcases of cash, though that certainly happened sometimes. Instead, he built relationships over years, did favors, made contributions, created relationships of mutual benefit and mutual compromise. By the time an official realized they were compromised, they were usually too deeply involved to pull back. This political corruption also provided Russell with intelligence about law enforcement activities. Corrupt officials would warn him about pending indictments, FBI investigations, or planned raids, allowing Russell to adjust his activities or destroy evidence. By the late 1960s, the American Mafia was at or near the peak of its power. Even though pressure from law enforcement was increasing, the five families in New York, the outfit in Chicago, and smaller families in cities across America controlled vast criminal empires. Organized crime had penetrated legitimate businesses, unions, politics, and even some entertainment and sports industries. Russell Bufalino stood near the top of this criminal hierarchy. He wasn't a commission member. His family was too small for that, but he was closely connected to commission families and frequently consulted on major decisions. His advice was valued, his mediation respected, his opinions considered. Russell had achieved something remarkable. He was powerful without being famous, wealthy without being flashy, respected without being feared, except by those who crossed him. He had built an empire that spanned multiple states and multiple criminal enterprises. But he remained a ghost, barely visible even to law enforcement, unknown to the general public. But the 1970s would test Russell in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. The same relationships that had made him powerful would eventually threaten to destroy him. The same connection that had brought him legitimate influence. His friendship with Jimmy Hoffa would end in violence, suspicion, and one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. In March 1967, after exhausting his appeals, Jimmy Hoffa finally entered federal prison to begin serving his 13-year sentence for jury tampering and fraud. He was sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, significantly Russell Bufalino's home territory. Hoffa's imprisonment created a complex situation for organized crime. On one hand, Hoffa had been enormously useful to the mob, providing access to Teamsters pension fund money and using union power to benefit various criminal enterprises. On the other hand, Hoffa was also somewhat unpredictable, strong-willed, and difficult to control. Some mob figures began wondering whether a more compliant Teamsters president might actually be better for their interests. Before entering prison, Hoffa had appointed Frank Fitzsimmons as acting president of the Teamsters. Fitzsimmons, a Hoffa loyalist, was expected to keep the position warm until Hoffa was released. But Fitzsimmons quickly discovered he enjoyed being president, and various mob figures discovered they enjoyed working with Fitzsimmons more than they had enjoyed working with Hoffa. Fitzsimmons was weaker than Hoffa, less charismatic, more willing to defer to mob wishes. He continued allowing mob access to pension fund money, but asked fewer questions and made fewer demands. From organized crime's perspective, Fitzsimmons was the perfect union leader, compliant, controllable, and content with his position. Russell Bufalino maintained his relationship with Hoffa during his imprisonment. Russell visited Hoffa at Lewisburg, sent messages through Frank Sheeran and others, and presumably provided some financial support to Hoffa's family. But Russell was also developing a relationship with Fitzsimmons, hedging his bets against the possibility that Hoffa might never return to power. In November 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. Nixon's relationship with the Teamsters and with Jimmy Hoffa would prove crucial for what came next. The Teamsters had supported Nixon's presidential campaign with both endorsements and financial contributions. Nixon's administration in turn was friendly to the union. This relationship was part of Nixon's Southern strategy, attracting white working-class voters, including union members, away from the Democratic Party. Hoffa from prison began lobbying for executive clemency. His lawyers argued that his conviction had been unjust, that he had been targeted by Robert Kennedy for political reasons, and that his continued imprisonment served no purpose. Behind the scenes, the Teamsters' political influence and contributions were used to pressure the Nixon administration to release Hoffa. On December 23, 1971, President Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence. Hoffa was released from prison after serving just 4 years and 9 months of his 13-year sentence. But there was a catch, a crucial condition that would ultimately lead to disaster. Nixon's commutation included a condition. Hoffa was prohibited from participating in union activities until 1980. This meant Hoffa could not return to his position as Teamsters president, could not officially involve himself in union business, and was effectively exiled from the organization he had built and led for decades. This restriction was almost certainly inserted at the behest of Fitzsimmons and mob figures who had grown comfortable with Fitzsimmons' pliable leadership. They wanted Hoffa out of prison. He had served enough time that clemency was defensible, and keeping him imprisoned might make him a martyr. But they didn't want him back in power. Hoffa was furious about this restriction. He believed he had been betrayed by Fitzsimmons, whom he had elevated to acting president with the understanding that Fitzsimmons would step aside upon Hoffa's release. He suspected, probably correctly, that organized crime had pushed for the restriction to keep him from reclaiming his position. Immediately upon his release, Hoffa began plotting his return to power. He challenged the restriction legally, arguing it was unconstitutional. He began rebuilding his base of support among rank and file Teamsters. He made public statements criticizing Fitzsimmons's leadership. He positioned himself for a run at the Teamsters presidency in 1976, when the restriction would presumably expire, though he hoped to overturn it sooner. This created a serious problem for Russell Bufalino and other mob figures. Hoffa was a national figure with enormous credibility among union workers. If he launched a campaign to reclaim the Teamsters' presidency, he might well succeed. And if he did, Hoffa would almost certainly seek revenge against those he believed had betrayed him, including mob figures who had supported Fitzsimmons. Moreover, Hoffa was angry, feeling betrayed and possibly reckless. He was making public statements that touched on mob involvement in the Teamsters. He was talking to journalists. He was writing a book. There were concerns that Hoffa, either intentionally or inadvertently, might reveal information that could damage organized crime's interests or lead to prosecutions. Russell Bufalino found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Hoffa was his friend, or at least had been. Frank Sheeran remained loyal to both Russell and Hoffa, creating a potential conflict. But Russell was also pragmatic. If Hoffa became too much of a liability, if his actions threatened Russell's interests or the broader interest of organized crime, something would have to be done. Exactly when and how the decision was made to kill Jimmy Hoffa remains subject to debate, but according to Frank Sheeran's later account and various other sources, by mid-1975, Russell Bufalino and other mob leaders had concluded that Hoffa had to die. Hoffa's campaign to reclaim the Teamsters presidency was gaining momentum. He was meeting with rank-and-file Teamsters across the country, building support, preparing for the 1976 election. He was also becoming increasingly vocal about Fitzsimmons's corruption and mob influence in the Union. While Hoffa himself was deeply connected to the mob, he apparently felt that attacking Fitzsimmons's mob ties might help his own campaign. A dangerous game that suggested Hoffa no longer fully understood his position. Additionally, there were growing concerns that Hoffa might cooperate with federal investigators to gain leverage in overturning his restriction on union activities. Hoffa had always been careful about what he told authorities, but desperation might make him less careful. The mob couldn't risk Hoffa providing information about pension fund loans, union corruption, or mob infiltration of the Teamsters. The decision to kill Hoffa would have required approval from multiple mob families, as Hoffa had relationships with organized crime figures across the country. According to various accounts, Russell Bufalino, Anthony Tony Provenzano, a Genovese family captain and Teamsters, official with whom Hoffa had feuded, and representatives of other families met and agreed that Hoffa had to go. The question was how to do it. Hoffa was cautious, surrounded by friends and supporters, and somewhat paranoid about his safety. Killing him would require someone he trusted to lure him to a location where he could be murdered without witnesses. That someone would be Frank Sheeran, according to Frank Sheeran's account given decades later to author Charles Brandt and published in the book I Heard You Paint Houses. Russell Bufalino called Sheeran in mid-July 1975 and asked him to perform a service. Russell didn't explicitly say what the service was, but Sheeran understood. He was being asked to kill Jimmy Hoffa. Sheeran later claimed he tried to refuse, pleaded with Russell to find another solution, but ultimately accepted that the order was final. In the Mafia, refusing an order from your boss wasn't an option, especially an order of this magnitude. The plan, according to Sheeran, was relatively simple. Hoffa was scheduled to meet with Tony Provenzano and Anthony Giacoloni, a Detroit mob captain, on July 30th, 1975, at the Mashu's Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit. The meeting was supposedly to resolve the feud between Hoffa and Provenzano and discuss Hoffa's return to the Teamsters. Hoffa believed this meeting might lead to mob support for his comeback. In reality, the meeting was a setup. Here's what we know for certain about July 30th, 1975. At approximately 2 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa arrived at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. He was supposed to meet Provenzano and Giacolone at 2 p.m. Hoffa waited in the restaurant parking lot. His intended meeting partners never arrived. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a pay phone at the restaurant, telling her that the people he was supposed to meet hadn't shown up and he was waiting a bit longer. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Hoffa was seen getting into a car in the restaurant parking lot. Witnesses reported seeing Hoffa with at least one other person, possibly more. The car drove away. Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again. According to Frank Sheeran's much later account, he was one of the men who picked up Hoffa that day. Sheeran claimed that Hoffa trusted him and willingly got into the car, believing they were going to a nearby house for the meeting with Provenzano and Giacolone. Instead, Sheeran said they drove to a house in Detroit, where Sheeran shot Hoffa twice in the back of the head. Hoffa's body was then transported from the scene and disposed of. Though Sheeran claimed he didn't know the final disposal location, Sheeran's account has been both supported and disputed by various investigators and journalists. Some find it credible, fitting known facts and explaining Hoffa's willingness to leave the restaurant with his killers. Others point out inconsistencies, question Sheeran's reliability, and note that some details of his account don't match physical evidence or other witness statements. The truth is, we don't know for certain what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. On July 30th, 1975, his body has never been found despite extensive searches. No one has ever been charged with his murder. The case remains officially open, one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. What we can say with reasonable confidence based on FBI investigations, testimony from various informants, and logical inference is that Russell Bufalino was involved in the decision to kill Hoffa and in organizing his murder. Even if Russell wasn't physically present when Hoffa died, the FBI certainly believed Russell was involved. Agents questioned him extensively about Hoffa's disappearance. They placed him under surveillance. They pressured his associates, trying to find someone who would provide evidence linking Russell to the murder, but they never found sufficient evidence to charge him. Russell characteristically said nothing. He denied any knowledge of Hoffa's disappearance. He expressed concern for his friend Jimmy. He suggested that perhaps Hoffa had simply run away or been killed by enemies Russell knew nothing about. He maintained his innocence with the calm, flat demeanor that had served him well throughout his criminal career. And without a body, without witnesses willing to testify, without physical evidence, the FBI couldn't prove anything. Hoffa's disappearance had several significant consequences. For the Teamsters, it resolved the leadership crisis. Frank Fitzsimmons remained president, continuing to provide organized crime with access to pension funds and union power. The threat of Hoffa's return was eliminated for organized crime. Hoffa's murder demonstrated the mob's continued power and ruthlessness. The message was clear. Even someone as prominent and powerful as Jimmy Hoffa couldn't challenge the mob and survive. This message was intended both for those within organized crime, who might consider betrayal, and for outsiders who might consider cooperation with law enforcement. For the public, Hoffa's disappearance became a cultural phenomenon. Books, articles, television shows, and eventually movies explored the mystery. Theories proliferated about what happened to Hoffa's body: buried under Giant Stadium, compacted in a junk car, dissolved in acid, buried in the Michigan woods, and countless others. The Hoffa disappearance entered American mythology as a symbol of mob power and law enforcement's limitations. For Russell Bufalino, Hoffa's murder was a tragedy on a personal level. He had genuinely liked Hoffa, but a necessity for business. Russell had made the hard calculation that preserving mob interests was more important than friendship. This cold pragmatism was what made Russell effective as a mob boss. But it also revealed the emptiness at the heart of organized crime's code of loyalty. In the end, everyone was expendable. The FBI's investigation into Hoffa's disappearance was massive and continues to this day. Agents interviewed hundreds of witnesses, followed thousands of leads, excavated multiple locations where informants claimed Hoffa was buried, and built extensive files on suspected participants in the murder. The investigation identified several individuals as likely involved: Frank Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, Tony Provenzano, Anthony Giacalone, Salvatore Sallybugs Bergoglio, a Provenzano associate suspected of being one of the actual shooters, and others. But identifying suspects and proving their guilt in court are entirely different matters. The FBI faced multiple obstacles. No body meant no crime scene, no forensic evidence, no autopsy determining cause of death. The murder had been well planned with multiple layers of insulation between the bosses who ordered it and the men who carried it out. Witnesses were either dead, refused to talk out of fear or loyalty, or provided accounts that couldn't be verified. The case quickly went cold, though it was never officially closed over the decades. Various informants have provided information about Hoffa's murder, and some of these accounts generally agree on the broad outlines. Hoffa was lured to a meeting, killed in a Detroit house, and his body disposed of in a way that prevented discovery. But the specific details vary, and none of these accounts have led to sufficient evidence for prosecution. In 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead. His wife Josephine maintained until her own death in 1980 that Jimmy was alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia. His son, James P. Hoffa, who became a lawyer and later president of the Teamsters himself, has long pushed for continued investigation into his father's murder. For Russell Bufalino, the aftermath of Hoffa's disappearance meant increased FBI scrutiny. But scrutiny he had learned to manage. He continued his operations, continued his quiet life in Kingston, Pennsylvania, and continued to maintain his innocence regarding Hoffa's fate. But the 1970s would bring other threats to Russell beyond the Hoffa investigation, threats that would eventually succeed where decades of law enforcement efforts had previously failed. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. This federal law was specifically designed to fight organized crime, and it would eventually prove devastatingly effective. RICO was revolutionary because it allowed prosecutors to charge the leaders of criminal organizations for ordering crimes. Even if those leaders never personally committed illegal acts previously, mob bosses had insulated themselves from prosecution by using subordinates to carry out crimes. The boss might order a murder, but he never pulled the trigger, never touched the weapon, never left physical evidence. Prosecutors could rarely prove the boss's involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. RICO changed this calculus. Under RICO, if prosecutors could prove that a criminal enterprise existed and that someone participated in that enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity, they could charge everyone involved in the enterprise, including leaders who never personally committed the predicate crimes. RICO also provided for severe penalties, including asset forfeiture that could destroy criminal organizations financially. However, RICO wasn't immediately effective. The law was passed in 1970, but prosecutors didn't fully understand how to use it until the late 1970s and early 1980s. Additionally, developing RICO cases required extensive investigation, cooperation from multiple law enforcement agencies, and patient accumulation of evidence over years. Early RICO prosecutions sometimes failed due to prosecutors' inexperience with the statute. But by the late 1970s, federal prosecutors were becoming skilled at using RICO, and organized crime was beginning to feel the pressure. Throughout the 1970s, the FBI dramatically expanded its surveillance of organized crime figures, including Russell Bufalino. The Bureau used increasingly sophisticated techniques: wiretaps on phones, hidden microphones in homes and businesses, physical surveillance teams, financial investigations tracking money flows, and intensive efforts to develop informants within mob families. Russell, always cautious, adapted to the increased surveillance. He avoided discussing criminal matters over the phone. He conducted important conversations while walking outside or in moving cars where hidden microphones were less likely. He used intermediaries and coded language. He kept minimal written records. He continued presenting himself as a legitimate businessman whose only crimes were, perhaps, some minor tax issues that many business people faced. But surveillance technology was improving faster than Russell could adapt. The FBI could now place incredibly small listening devices in locations that were nearly impossible to detect. They could monitor conversations from considerable distances. They could track vehicles with electronic devices. The technological advantage was shifting away from criminals and toward law enforcement. Moreover, the FBI was patiently building a comprehensive picture of Russell's organization, documenting who met with whom, tracking money flows, identifying the structure of his crime family, understanding his various criminal enterprises. Even if individual pieces of evidence weren't sufficient for prosecution, collectively, they were building towards something substantial for the Mafia. The late 1970s and 1980s brought a crisis of loyalty. Traditionally, the Code of Omerta, silence had been absolute. Made members did not cooperate with law enforcement under any circumstances. Going to prison was acceptable. Betraying the organization was not. This code had protected organized crime for generations. But several factors were eroding Omerta. The severe penalties under RICO meant mobsters faced spending the rest of their lives in prison. The FBI's Witness Protection Program offered cooperating witnesses new identities and protection from retaliation. Younger mobsters, some felt, lacked the old-school commitment to the code, and the mob itself was becoming more fractious, with internal betrayals and murders that made members less loyal to organizations that might kill them. The result was an increasing number of mobsters flipping, agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. These informants provided insider information about mob structure, operations, and specific crimes that external surveillance could never reveal. For Russell Bufalino, the informant problem was particularly dangerous. He had operated successfully for decades, partly because his associates were loyal and kept silent. If that loyalty eroded, if men who knew his secrets started talking, Russell's careful insulation from criminal acts would prove insufficient protection. In 1977, Russell Bufalino suffered his first major criminal conviction. He was found guilty of extortion related to threatening a witness in a related case. The conviction resulted from an incident where Russell had allegedly attempted to intimidate someone preparing to testify in a criminal trial. The details of this case are less important than what it represented. After decades of avoiding serious criminal conviction, Russell had finally been successfully prosecuted. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. This was a significant blow, both practically and symbolically. Practically, Russell would lose direct day-to-day control over his organization during his imprisonment, though he could certainly continue exerting influence from prison symbolically. The conviction demonstrated that Russell was no longer untouchable. That law enforcement was finally succeeding in holding him accountable. Russell entered federal prison in 1978 at age 74 for a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding imprisonment, who had prided himself on operating carefully enough to evade prosecution. This must have been a bitter experience. But Russell was resilient. He adapted to prison life, maintained communication with his organization through visitors and coded letters, and continued exerting influence as best he could from behind bars. Many mob bosses had run their organizations from prison. It was difficult, but not impossible. Russell's time in federal prison lasted from 1978 to 1980 on the extortion conviction, but it was only the beginning of his legal troubles. Even as he was serving this sentence, prosecutors were building additional cases against him. Prison at age 74 was undoubtedly difficult. Russell was not a young man who could easily handle the physical and psychological challenges of incarceration. His health was beginning to decline. High blood pressure, heart problems, the various ailments of advancing age. He needed medications, careful monitoring, and medical care that prison infirmaries were not well equipped to provide. But Russell endured as he had endured many difficulties throughout his life. He refused to complain publicly, refused to show weakness, maintained his dignity and his silence. Other inmates afforded him respect based on his reputation. Guards treated him with cautious courtesy, aware of who he was, and unwilling to provoke unnecessary problems. During this imprisonment, Russell's organization continued operating under the leadership of his underboss and captains. Criminal organizations are designed to function even when leaders are imprisoned or killed. It's part of their resilience. But Russell's absence created opportunities for rivals and uncertainties about the future. While Russell was dealing with his own legal problems, the FBI was preparing what would become the most significant RICO prosecution in history. The Commission case, formerly known as United States v. Carmine, Persico et al., the Commission case, prosecuted by federal prosecutor Rudy Giuliani, who would later become mayor of New York City, charged the leaders of New York's 5 mafia families with running a criminal enterprise. The case was based on the theory that the Mafia Commission itself was a criminal organization, and that Commission members had participated in various criminal activities, including murder, extortion, and labor racketeering. The Commission case went to trial in 1985 and resulted in convictions of multiple bosses, including Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, and others. These convictions sent shockwaves through organized crime. The most powerful mob bosses in America were sentenced to 100-year prison terms, essentially life sentences. Russell Bufalino wasn't directly involved in the Commission case. His family was too small to have Commission representation, but the case affected him profoundly. His longtime allies and associates were being imprisoned for life. The old guard was being systematically removed. The mafia structure that had existed since the 1930s was being dismantled by RICO prosecutions. The Commission case also demonstrated that being a top-level mob boss no longer provided protection from prosecution. In earlier decades, bosses had been nearly untouchable because prosecutors couldn't prove their involvement in specific crimes. RICO eliminated that protection. If you were part of the enterprise, you were criminally liable for the enterprise's crimes. In 1981, shortly after his release from prison on the extortion conviction, Russell was indicted again, this time on RICO charges. The indictment alleged that Russell had led a criminal enterprise engaged in extortion, murder, conspiracy, and other crimes. The RICO case against Russell was based on years of investigation, surveillance, and testimony from several cooperating witnesses. Prosecutors alleged that Russell had ordered various crimes, benefited from criminal activities, and led an organization whose purpose was to commit crimes. Russell, now in his late 70s, faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted. The charges were serious, the evidence substantial, and the prosecutors experienced with RICO cases. But Russell's lawyers mounted a vigorous defense. They challenged the reliability of cooperating witnesses, arguing these men were criminals who would say anything to reduce their own sentences. They argued that Russell was an elderly, legitimate businessman being persecuted by overzealous prosecutors. They sought to poke holes in the complex web of evidence prosecutors had assembled. The trial dragged on for months. Russell, maintaining his innocence and dignity, attended court sessions each day, sitting quietly, conferring with his attorneys, showing no emotion as witnesses testified against him. In 1982, Russell Bufalino was convicted on RICO charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Combined with his age and declining health, this sentence was effectively a life sentence. Russell would almost certainly die in prison, or shortly after release. Throughout the 1980s, the old guard of American organized crime was dying, in prison from natural causes or from mob hits. The generation that had built the modern mafia during Prohibition and had dominated organized crime for 50 years was passing away. Stefano Magaddino, Russell's longtime patron and ally, had died in 1974 of heart disease at age 82. His Buffalo crime family, which had been powerful for decades, began to decline after his death. Carlo Gambino, considered by many to be the most powerful mob boss of the 1960s and 1970s, died of a heart attack in 1976 at age 74. His Gambino family remained powerful under subsequent bosses, but Gambino himself was irreplaceable. Numerous other bosses, underbosses, and powerful captains died throughout the decade. Some from natural causes, some from mob violence, some in prison. The institutional knowledge, the relationships, the old world culture that had defined the mafia for generations was being lost. Russell watched this happen from prison, knowing he was among the last survivors of his generation. The men he had worked with, negotiated with, and built relationships with over 50 years were gone. The organization he had known was transforming into something different, run by younger men with different values and different approaches. Russell's health deteriorated significantly during his imprisonment in the 1980s. He suffered from various ailments common to men in their 80s. Heart disease, high blood pressure, respiratory problems. He required multiple medications and regular medical monitoring. Prison officials, aware that allowing Russell to die in custody could create problems and potentially make him a martyr, provided adequate medical care, but prison medical facilities were not equipped to handle serious health crises, and Russell's condition was tenuous. Russell's lawyers repeatedly sought his early release on compassionate grounds, arguing that he was an elderly sick man who posed no threat to society and who should be allowed to die in peace with his family. Prosecutors generally opposed these motions, arguing that Russell had chosen his criminal path and should serve his sentence regardless of age or health. The legal battles over Russell's imprisonment and release requests continued for years, with judges generally siding with prosecutors, but occasionally granting temporary medical releases or transfers to facilities better equipped to handle Russell's health needs. Frank Sheeran, Russell's longtime associate and the man who allegedly killed Jimmy Hoffa on Russell's orders, was also facing legal troubles in the 1980s. Sheeran was convicted of labor, racketeering, and sentenced to prison time himself. The relationship between Russell and Sheeran during this period is unclear. Both men were in federal custody at various times, making communication difficult. There's no evidence that Sheeran ever considered cooperating with prosecutors against Russell. And indeed, Sheeran maintained his silence about the Hoffa murder for decades. But the possibility of Sheeran flipping must have concerned Russell. In the event, Sheeran remained loyal, at least during a time when his testimony could have harmed Russell legally. Only much later, when both men were old and Russell was dead, would Sheeran finally break his silence and tell his story to author Charles Brandt. Despite Russell's imprisonment and declining health, his crime family continued operating throughout the 1980s. Underbosses and captains ran day-to-day operations, collecting from various rackets, managing relationships with other families, and keeping the organization functioning. But the family was undoubtedly weakened. Russell's personal authority, his national connections, his reputation, these couldn't be easily transferred to subordinates. The family's power and influence diminished as Russell's personal role diminished. Additionally, law enforcement pressure on the family continued. Various members were arrested and prosecuted on different charges. The FBI continued surveillance and continued developing informants. The family was slowly being ground down by sustained law enforcement pressure, combined with the loss of Russell's leadership. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family would not survive Russell's death intact. The family would continue in some form, but it would be smaller, weaker, less significant in the national organized crime picture. The 1980s brought profound changes to American organized crime beyond just law enforcement pressure. The drug trade, particularly cocaine and later crack cocaine, was transforming the criminal underworld. New criminal organizations, Colombian cartels, Dominican drug gangs, Asian organized crime groups, motorcycle gangs, and others were competing with the traditional Italian American Mafia. The Mafia's old revenue sources were also becoming less reliable. Gambling was being legalized in more states, reducing illegal gambling profits. Labor unions were declining in membership and influence, reducing opportunities for union racketeering. Legitimate businesses were becoming more professional and less vulnerable to mob infiltration. The younger generation of Italian Americans was assimilating into mainstream American society, pursuing legitimate careers and showing less interest in organized crime. The tight-knit Italian immigrant communities that had sustained the Mafia were disappearing. The code of omerta was eroding as more mobsters cooperated with law enforcement. Russell Bufalino, from his prison cell, watched the world he had known disappear. The organization he had built over 50 years was fading. The partnerships and alliances that had defined his career were breaking down as his contemporaries died. The methods he had perfected, patient infiltration of unions, careful cultivation of political connections, maintaining a low profile, were becoming less effective against modern surveillance technology and RICO prosecutions. It must have been profoundly disorienting for a man who had been so successful for so long to watch everything crumble in his final years. In 1989, Russell Bufalino was released from federal prison. He was 85 years old in poor health, but finally free after spending much of the 1980s behind bars. Russell returned to Kingston, Pennsylvania, to the small northeastern Pennsylvania city that had been his base of operations for over half a century. But he returned to a very different world than the one he had left. His organization was a shadow of its former self. Many of his associates were dead or imprisoned. His power was gone. He was an old man in declining health, living on memories of past glory. Russell moved into a retirement home, requiring constant care due to his various health problems. He lived quietly, rarely leaving the facility, seeing occasional family visitors to the facility staff and other residents. He was just another elderly man in failing health. Most had no idea who he had been, what he had done, the power he had once wielded. The FBI continued to monitor Russell occasionally, but more out of institutional habit than because he posed any threat. He was no longer active in criminal operations. His influence was gone. He was simply an old man waiting to die. Russell's final years from 1989 to 1994 were quiet and sad. He had outlived nearly all his contemporaries. His wife, Carrie, had died. His organization had essentially dissolved. The world of organized crime he had known had transformed into something he barely recognized. There's a particular tragedy in Russell's final years. He had spent his entire adult life accumulating power, building an empire, establishing himself as one of the most influential mobsters in America. He had been successful beyond what a poor Sicilian immigrant coal miner could have reasonably dreamed. He had wealth, respect, influence. But in the end, what did he have? He was alone in a nursing home, his power gone, his associates dead or imprisoned, his life's work destroyed by law enforcement, his reputation known only to those who studied organized crime history. He couldn't enjoy his wealth. He was too old and sick. He couldn't exercise his power. It no longer existed. He couldn't share memories with contemporaries. They were gone. The code of omerta that had governed his life meant he couldn't even tell his story honestly, couldn't explain what he had really done, couldn't claim credit for his accomplishments such as they were. He had to maintain the fiction that he had been simply a businessman, that all the allegations were lies, that he knew nothing about murders or extortion or corruption. Russell Bufalino spent his final years imprisoned by his own silence. On February 25, 1994, Russell Bufalino died in a nursing home in Kingston, Pennsylvania. The cause of death was listed as natural causes related to his various health problems. He was 90 years old. Russell's death received minimal media attention. A few newspapers ran brief obituaries noting his death and mentioning his alleged mob connections. The FBI made note of his passing in their files. Various prosecutors and investigators who had spent years trying to bring Russell to justice learned of his death with mixed feelings. Satisfaction that he had eventually faced some consequences. Frustration that he had died essentially as a free man after such a long criminal career. Russell's funeral was held in Kingston, a small, quiet affair. Unlike the massive funerals that had marked the deaths of some prominent mobsters, John Gotti's funeral in 2002 would draw thousands. Russell's funeral was attended by perhaps a few dozen people, family members, a few old associates who had survived and were healthy enough to attend, some curious locals. This modest funeral was entirely appropriate for Russell's life and philosophy. He had always avoided the spotlight, always preferred invisibility to fame, always operated quietly. His death, like his life, drew minimal public attention. But among those who study organized crime, among law enforcement officials who had tracked the mafia for decades, among the dwindling community of old mobsters who remembered the glory days, Russell Bufalino's death marked the end of an era. He was among the last survivors of the generation that had built the modern American Mafia, one of the final links to the world of organized crime that had dominated the mid-20th century. The few obituaries published after Russell's death struggled with how to characterize him. He had never been convicted of murder, though many suspected he had ordered numerous killings. He had run a relatively small crime family, yet had wielded national influence. He had operated for over 50 years, yet remained largely unknown to the general public. The New York Times ran a brief obituary describing Russell as a crime figure who was believed to be one of the most powerful mobsters in Pennsylvania and mentioning his conviction for extortion and RICO violations. The Philadelphia Inquirer provided more detail describing Russell's alleged role in the Hoffa disappearance and his long career in organized crime. But these obituaries, necessarily limited by space and by the need to avoid actionable claims about a recently deceased person, couldn't fully capture who Russell had been or what he had accomplished. They presented facts, convictions, allegations, dates without conveying the full scope of Russell's career or his significance within organized crime. To truly understand Russell Bufalino's legacy, we need to look beyond the obituaries. Russell Bufalino operated differently than almost any other major organized crime figure in American history. And understanding those differences helps explain both his success and his relative obscurity. Invisibility as strategy. While most powerful mobsters eventually became celebrities, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, John Gotti, Sam Giancana, Russell deliberately remained invisible. This wasn't just avoiding unnecessary publicity. It was a fundamental strategy. Russell understood that fame meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant law enforcement attention, and law enforcement attention meant risk. By remaining unknown to the general public, Russell could operate with less pressure than his more famous contemporaries. Diplomat over warrior, many mob bosses built their reputations on violence. Russell certainly used violence when necessary, but he preferred negotiation, mediation, and compromise. He was known for resolving disputes between other families, for finding solutions that allowed everyone to profit, for avoiding unnecessary conflicts. This diplomatic approach made him valuable to other families and helped him survive in a world where more violent bosses often ended up dead or imprisoned. Legitimate business cover. Russell maintained legitimate businesses throughout his career, and these weren't just fronts. They were actual functioning businesses that generated real profits. This provided legal income to explain his lifestyle, gave him a respectable identity in his community, and created genuine connections with legitimate business people and politicians who didn't realize or chose not to know about his criminal activities. Long-term thinking, Russell played the long game. He built relationships over decades, invested in operations that would pay off years later, avoided short-term gains that might create long-term problems. Many mobsters thought in terms of immediate profit. Russell thought in terms of sustained long-term revenue and security. Geographical strategy. Russell's base in northeastern Pennsylvania was brilliant strategy. It was close enough to major cities, New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, for Russell to maintain important connections and operations, but far enough away to avoid the intense law enforcement scrutiny those cities attracted. Kingston, Pennsylvania was perfect territory for a mob boss who valued invisibility, political, and union infiltration. Russell's most sophisticated operations involved infiltrating unions and corrupting politicians. These activities were more complex and harder to prosecute than traditional crimes like gambling or murder. They also generated enormous profits and influence. Russell understood that controlling unions and politicians gave him more power than controlling street criminals. Restraint. Perhaps most importantly, Russell exercised restraint. He didn't flaunt his wealth, didn't seek publicity, didn't engage in unnecessary violence, didn't take risks that weren't justified by potential rewards. This restraint, unusual in organized crime, allowed Russell to survive and thrive for over 50 years. Russell Bufalino's legacy is inseparable from the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. While Russell participated in many crimes over his long career, he is primarily remembered for his alleged role in ordering Hoffa's murder. This is somewhat ironic. The Hoffa hit, if Russell did indeed order it, was just one of many significant actions Russell took over 5 decades. But it became the defining event of his criminal career. Because Hoffa was so famous, and because his disappearance became one of the great unsolved mysteries of American crime, the Hoffa connection has both enhanced and distorted Russell's historical legacy. On one hand, it has kept his name alive in ways it otherwise wouldn't have been. Without the Hoffa connection, Russell might have faded into complete obscurity like many other mob bosses. On the other hand, the focus on Hoffa has overshadowed much of what made Russell significant. His long career, his diplomatic skills, his success at remaining invisible, his sophisticated infiltration of unions and legitimate businesses. When people remember Russell Bufalino today, if they remember him at all, it's usually in the context of the mob boss who ordered the hit on Jimmy Hoffa. This isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete. From the FBI's perspective, Russell Bufalino represented both a success and a failure. The success was eventually convicting him and effectively ending his criminal career. The failure was how long it took and how much he got away with. FBI agents who worked organized crime cases in Pennsylvania and New York during the 1970s and 1980s have described Russell with grudging respect. They acknowledged his intelligence, his caution, and his effectiveness. One agent reportedly said that Russell was the smartest mobster we ever faced in Pennsylvania. And the most frustrating, the FBI built extensive files on Russell over decades, but struggled to build prosecutable cases against him. He didn't talk on phones about criminal business. He met associates in places where surveillance was difficult. He insulated himself from direct involvement in crimes. He cultivated relationships with local police and politicians who would warn him about investigations. When the FBI finally did convict Russell using RICO statutes in the 1980s, it felt like a victory, but a bittersweet one. Russell was already an old man. His most active criminal years were behind him. He would serve relatively little prison time before his death. He had enjoyed decades of criminal profits and power before facing serious consequences. Moreover, the FBI never solved what they considered their most important Russell Bufalino case, Jimmy Hoffa's murder. They knew Russell was involved, but they couldn't prove it. When Russell died in 1994, he took his secrets with him. After Russell's death, the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family continued to exist, but as a much diminished organization. Various individuals claimed leadership or held leadership positions, but none had Russell's stature, connections, or influence. The family remained involved in traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, some labor racketeering, but on a much smaller scale. Law enforcement continued to monitor the organization, but considered it a relatively low priority compared to larger, more active crime families. By the 2000s and 2010s, the northeastern Pennsylvania family had largely faded into insignificance. Various members were periodically arrested and prosecuted for different crimes, but the organization as a coherent, powerful criminal enterprise had essentially ceased to exist. This decline reflected both the specific loss of Russell's leadership and the broader decline of the Italian-American Mafia. The organization Russell had built was too tied to his personal relationships, his reputation, and his skills to survive his death intact. Russell Bufalino's death in 1994 came during a period of profound decline for the American Mafia. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s had imprisoned or killed much of the organization's leadership. Younger Italian Americans were choosing legitimate careers over organized crime. The tight-knit Italian immigrant communities that had sustained the Mafia were largely gone. The Code of Omerta had eroded with numerous mobsters cooperating with prosecutors. The Mafia still exists today, but it's a shadow of what it was during Russell's heyday. The organization that once controlled major sectors of the American economy, that corrupted unions and politicians that operated with near impunity in many cities, has been reduced to a relatively small criminal enterprise with limited power and influence. This decline wasn't inevitable. It resulted from sustained law enforcement pressure, changing social conditions, and internal weaknesses within the Mafia itself. But watching this decline from his nursing home in the early 1990s, Russell must have understood that the world he had known was gone forever. For 25 years after Russell Bufalino's death, he remained largely forgotten except by organized crime historians and law enforcement officials. Then in 2019, director Martin Scorsese released The Irishman, a film based on Charles Brandt's book, I Heard You Paint Houses, which told Frank Sheeran's story and prominently featured Russell Bufalino. In the film, Russell was portrayed by Joe Pesci in a quiet, understated performance that captured Russell's low-key approach to organized crime. The film depicted Russell's relationship with Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa, including Russell's alleged role in ordering Hoffa's murder. The Irishman introduced Russell Bufalino to a mainstream audience that had never heard of him. Suddenly, The mob boss who had spent his life avoiding publicity was being portrayed by an Oscar-winning actor in a major film by one of America's greatest directors. The invisibility Russell had so carefully cultivated was retrospectively destroyed. The film sparked renewed interest in Russell's story. Journalists wrote articles about him. True crime enthusiasts researched his life. Law enforcement agencies reviewed their files. The FBI received new tips about the Hoffa disappearance, some claiming to know where Hoffa was buried based on information supposedly obtained from people connected to Russell's organization. This cultural impact would likely have horrified Russell. He had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of attention. But it also ensured that his story wouldn't be completely forgotten, that his significance within organized crime history would be recognized, even if that recognition came posthumously, and in ways he never would have wanted. Russell Bufalino was one of the most successful and significant organized crime figures in American history. Yet, he remained largely unknown throughout his life, and even after his death, until The Irishman brought his story to a mainstream audience. He built a criminal empire that lasted over 50 years, survived numerous threats from law enforcement and rival criminals, accumulated significant wealth and power, influenced major events in American labor and political history, and eventually died as a free man at age 90, despite a lifetime of serious crimes. This represents success by any measure, criminal or otherwise. Russell achieved what he set out to achieve: power, wealth, and influence. And he did so while avoiding the violent deaths or long imprisonments that befell most of his contemporaries. Yet his success was also his tragedy. Russell spent his entire adult life building something that couldn't last. His criminal empire was founded on violence, corruption, and betrayal. It enriched him, but harmed countless others. It gave him power, but isolated him from honest human connections. It provided material success, but no real legacy worth celebrating. In his final years, Russell must have reflected on this paradox. He had won by the rules of organized crime. He had survived, thrived, and died in his own bed rather than in prison or from an assassin's bullet. But what had he really won? His organization would not outlive him. His name would be remembered, if at all, as a criminal. He had no accomplishments he could honestly claim credit for. His life's work had been devoted to activities that, from any moral perspective, were indefensible. Russell Bufalino was brilliant, patient, disciplined, and strategic. He possessed qualities that applied to legitimate endeavors could have made him successful in legal business or politics. Instead, he chose organized crime, and that choice defined and ultimately limited everything he achieved. If Russell Bufalino could write his own epitaph, something his commitment to invisibility would never have allowed, what would it say? Perhaps he survived. That was Russell's greatest achievement and his guiding principle. In a world where most mob bosses ended up dead or imprisoned by middle age, Russell lived to 90 and died as a free man. In an environment where violence was common and betrayal frequent, Russell navigated dangerous waters for over 50 years. In an era when law enforcement became increasingly sophisticated and determined, Russell evaded serious conviction until he was an old man. Survival required intelligence, caution, adaptability, and luck. Russell possessed all these qualities in abundance. He understood that staying alive and free was more important than being famous or feared. He grasped that real power was exercised quietly, that true influence required patience, that lasting success meant avoiding unnecessary risks. But survival, while impressive, is ultimately a defensive goal. Russell survived. And then what? His survival didn't produce anything of lasting value. It didn't create anything worth preserving. It didn't contribute to society or improve the world. It was simply survival for survival's sake. This is perhaps the final most important lesson of Russell Bufalino's life. Survival without purpose, success without virtue, power without legitimacy. These things are ultimately empty, regardless of how skillfully they're achieved. And so we return to our opening question. What if the most powerful mobster in American history was a man the FBI didn't even photograph until he was 64 years old? Russell Bufalino's story forces us to reconsider what we think we know about organized crime. The mafia bosses who became household names, Capone, Luciano Gotti, were powerful and influential, but their fame was often inversely proportional to their longevity and ultimate success. They burned brightly and died young or spent decades in prison. Russell chose a different path. He accumulated power through patience rather than spectacular violence. He exercised influence through relationships rather than public displays of authority. He built his empire in the shadows away from headlines and cameras and public attention. This approach proved remarkably effective. Russell wielded significant power in the Teamsters Union, influenced national organized crime decisions, controlled criminal operations across multiple states, accumulated substantial wealth, and lived freely for most of his 90 years. By the practical metrics of criminal success, Russell Bufalino was among the most successful mobsters in American history. Yet his very success at remaining invisible means his story has been largely forgotten. While true crime enthusiasts can recite details about Al Capone or John Gotti, few had heard of Russell Bufalino until Martin Scorsese's film brought his story to a mainstream audience 75 years after Russell began his criminal career. This invisibility was intentional. Russell understood that fame was dangerous in organized crime. He watched flashier mobsters attract law enforcement attention and media scrutiny that contributed to their downfall. He deliberately cultivated obscurity as a protective strategy, but invisibility came with costs. Russell's accomplishments, such as they were, went unrecognized. His influence was rarely acknowledged. His skills weren't appreciated except by the small community of people who knew who he really was. He spent his life accumulating power that he could never openly claim or enjoy. There's a profound loneliness in Russell's story. He couldn't trust most people because trust was dangerous in his world. He couldn't be honest about his life because honesty meant prison. He couldn't share his real self with his community in Kingston because that community knew him only through his carefully constructed false identity. He was surrounded by people, associates, family, community members, but ultimately alone with his secrets. One of Russell's nicknames was the Puppet Master, and the metaphor is apt. A puppet master operates from behind the scenes, invisible to the audience, manipulating strings that control the visible performers. The puppets get attention. The puppet master remains hidden. Russell pulled strings throughout the American labor movement in organized crime families across the country, political offices from small-town Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C. He influenced decisions about who would lead unions, who would receive pension fund loans, which politicians would be supported, which rivals would be eliminated. But like an actual puppet master, Russell remained behind the curtain. Others took the spotlight, absorbed the attention, faced the consequences. Russell influenced events while avoiding responsibility. This puppet master role required extraordinary skill. Russell needed to understand power dynamics, anticipate how people would react to various pressures, identify leverage points where small actions could produce large effects. He needed to maintain relationships with people across different organizations and different cities. He needed to balance competing interests and resolve conflicts without anyone realizing he was doing so. The puppet master role also required patience. Unlike mob bosses who exercised power directly through violence or intimidation, Russell's influence was often indirect and gradual. He planted ideas, made suggestions, created situations where people would make decisions that served Russell's interests while believing they were acting independently. This sophisticated approach to power is rarely seen in organized crime. Where most criminals prefer more direct methods, Russell's puppet master approach was more characteristic of intelligence agencies or political operators than traditional mobsters. It reflected his intelligence and his understanding that indirect power can be more effective and sustainable than direct force. Russell Bufalino's death in 1994 marked the end of an era in American organized crime. He was among the last survivors of the generation that had built the modern mafia during Prohibition that had established the commission system in the 1930s, that had infiltrated unions and legitimate businesses during the 1940s and 1950s, that had reached the peak of high mafia power in the 1960s and 1970s, the mafia that Russell knew with its old world Sicilian traditions, its code of omerta, its deep infiltration of American institutions, its relative impunity from law enforcement, was disappearing by the time of his death. RICO prosecutions had decimated leadership. Younger Italian Americans were choosing legitimate careers. Informants were breaking the code of silence. New criminal organizations were competing for traditional mafia revenue sources. Russell had watched this transformation with the sadness of someone seeing their world disappear. The institutions he had relied on were crumbling. The relationships he had cultivated were dissolving. The methods he had perfected were becoming obsolete. The code he had lived by was being abandoned. In his final years, Russell must have felt like a dinosaur, an extinct species lingering past its time, watching the world change in ways that rendered everything he had known irrelevant. But Russell's story, even in its tragedy, captures something important about an era of American history. The mid-20th century was a time when organized crime wielded enormous power, when corruption was widespread, when parallel institutions existed alongside official government and business. Understanding this era requires understanding figures like Russell Bufalino, not celebrating them, but recognizing their significance. We cannot end Russell Bufalino's story without returning once more to Jimmy Hoffa, whose disappearance defines Russell's legacy for most people who know the name at all. The question, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, remains one of the great mysteries of American crime. Numerous theories have been proposed, numerous locations searched, numerous suspects identified. Yet nearly 50 years after Hoffa vanished from that restaurant parking lot, we still don't know for certain what happened to him. The most credible theory, supported by FBI investigators and various informants, is that Russell Bufalino ordered Hoffa's murder, that Frank, Sheeran, and possibly others carried it out, and that Hoffa's body was disposed of in a way that prevented discovery, perhaps cremated, perhaps buried under a construction site, perhaps otherwise destroyed, but we don't know for certain. And because Russell, Sheeran, and most others involved are now dead, we may never know. There's something fitting about this uncertainty. Russell Bufalino spent his life creating and maintaining mysteries, operating behind veils of secrecy, ensuring that what he did remained hidden. The Hoffa disappearance, with its enduring mystery, stands as a final testament to Russell's ability to act without leaving definitive evidence. If Russell did order Hoffa's murder, and the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests he did, then it represents both his power and his moral bankruptcy. Russell had the authority to order the death of one of the most famous union leaders in America. He could make a man disappear so completely that nearly 50 years of investigation couldn't definitively solve the crime. That's extraordinary power. But Russell used this power to kill a man who had been his friend, or at least his ally. He ordered Hoffa's murder for pragmatic reasons. Hoffa had become inconvenient, potentially dangerous to mob interests. Russell made a cold calculation that killing Hoffa was necessary. and he acted on that calculation without apparent remorse. This ruthless pragmatism, this willingness to kill when necessary, without emotion or hesitation, was fundamental to Russell's success in organized crime. But it also reveals the emptiness at the core of his life. Russell's relationships, even his friendship with Hoffa, were ultimately transactional. When people no longer served Russell's interests, they became expendable. This is not a life philosophy worth emulating or celebrating, regardless of how successful it proved in criminal terms. And so ends the story of Russell Bufalino, the most powerful mobster you've never heard of. A man who built a criminal empire in the shadows, who influenced American labor and politics for decades, who quite possibly ordered the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, and who lived 90 years largely according to his own terms. Russell's life spanned nearly the entire 20th century, from 1903 to 1994, from horses and wagons to computers and the internet, from Sicily's rural poverty to American suburban prosperity, from complete obscurity to posthumously being portrayed in a major Hollywood film. He lived through Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, Watergate, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. He watched America transform from a developing nation to a global superpower. He witnessed the rise and decline of the American Mafia. Through all these changes, Russell remained focused on his own interests, accumulating power, generating income, avoiding prosecution, surviving. He achieved remarkable success by those metrics. He also lived a life that, examined honestly, was fundamentally empty and destructive. If you've made it this far, you're a true crime legend. You've spent hours listening to the story of a man whose name you probably didn't know before today. A man who deliberately tried to remain unknown. A man whose legacy is complex and troubling. So let me ask you, do you think Frank Sheeran really killed Jimmy Hoffa on Russell's orders? Do you believe Sheeran's deathbed confession? Or do you think it was the embellishment of an old man seeking attention? Where do you think Hoffa's body is? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And what gangster should I cover next? Let me know who you want to hear about. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive crime stories. Hit that like button if you learned something new tonight. Check out my other videos on organized crime, unsolved mysteries, and American criminal history. Sleep well and remember, the quietest people are often the most dangerous. Russell Bufalino proved that over 50 years of criminal activity, while flashier mobsters made headlines and went to prison or died young, Russell operated quietly, accumulated real power, and died in his own bed at age 90. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps thinking about Russell's story, consider the choices he made and the consequences that followed. Consider the difference between success and significance, between power and purpose, between survival and meaning. Russell Bufalino survived 90 years and built a criminal empire. But when he died, what remained? No lasting institutions, no positive legacy, no achievements worth celebrating, just memories of harm done, lives destroyed, and an organization that immediately began disintegrating without his presence. This is the ultimate cautionary tale hidden within Russell's story of criminal success. We can achieve everything by worldly measures, wealth, power, influence, and still end up with nothing of real value. The question isn't just whether we succeed, but what we succeed at and what we leave behind. Russell Bufalino was the most powerful mobster you've never heard of. And perhaps he should have remained unknown. His power was real, but ultimately meaningless. His success was impressive, but ultimately empty. His life was long, but ultimately wasted on pursuits that harmed others and produced nothing of lasting value. Sleep well. Good night. And may your own pursuits be more worthy than Russell Bufalino's were.